Hi, Misha here. Haven't had a lot of video time lately, and it was another long day. The week or two before Christmas can be pretty hectic in any retail. Yeah, anyway, before I hit the hay, I felt like doing a video revisiting the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, aka the Huey. And in an older video, you saw this model here. This is a UH-1B hog, or gun shop model from Amercom. But I've got new models to show that haven't been in any videos before, so I thought I'd do another video and kind of a model comparison. This is an Agusta AB204. This is a licensed production from Bell, and it made in Italy of, well, the 204, which is analogous to a model A, B, C, F, etc. And this particular model is from the Austrian Air Force, but yeah, it's just another version. Then have a model from Altaya. This is a U.S. Air Force UH-1N. This is the so-called Twin Huey. It also has the larger fuselage, first introduced with the D and H models. It has two engines, hence the twin. While used by the American military, this version was actually first developed by Bell for Canadian order. And finally, I have one more from Altaya, and this is another Agusta. This is an AB212 ASW. This is like this over here, but this is a navalized version designed for anti-submarine and anti-shipping warfare, so more combat. So on the table I have basically two cargo transport versions and two combat versions. All four are diecast, all are 1/72 scale, and all are actually quite cheap, which is always fun, and why I have four of them. So yeah, I thought we'd just chat a little bit and kind of compare Amercom to Hobbymaster to Altaya. Now I will say, before we even get going, while this is a Hobbymaster, it's a very early Hobbymaster, so it's not quite as refined as some of the later ones you might be accustomed to. But that's not to say it's necessarily a bad model. Well, let's just jump right into it before I fall asleep. Figured start with the 204B, because you haven't seen this Hobbymaster model yet, and also because this is kind of the initial look and idea behind the Huey. Dates back to 1952. Now I am going to do a series of videos covering the early helicopters, like for example the Sikorskis and the Jolly Green Giant and the Retriever. But basically the military, kind of the Army spearheading things, identified a need for a new helicopter. They needed it to be a medium transport for cargo and personnel, also capable of medevac, and also capable of pilot training. And they felt that none of the helicopters in service or even on the drawing boards suited their needs. They were either too big, too complicated, underpowered, or a combo of all three. So they needed a new chopper. They gave requirements, and several companies, including Sikorsky, Bell, and Cammon, which I did the video on the SH2 Sea Sprite, submitted designs. The Bell submission was known as the XH-40-1. And in 1955 it was selected. The government ordered 3 advanced prototypes. And the first of these flew in October of 1956. And 2 more would fly in 1957, which would, be the YH. And then this would eventually evolve into the HU-1. And it was officially named the Iroquois. But of course, HU-1 looks like HUI, and that's where the name Huey came from. Now, of course, in September of 1962, because things were getting crazy in the naming conventions, especially thanks to the U.S. Navy, there was the Joint Services kind of arrangement of names ordered by the White House, and so the HU-1 became the UH-1, with the first version known as the UH-1A. So even though the Huey name really no longer made a lot of sense, it was kept. And kind of became a trademark and something Bell marketed and took advantage of. So yeah, these were finally officially adopted in 1959. The first ones were delivered in 1960. And actually, the earliest ones were sent over to Vietnam by 1962. Now, interestingly, these were only supposed to be for kind of field tests, evaluation. And they essentially said nuts to that and started putting them right in the middle of the action and, they get you practical feedback. Kind of like how the AR-15 M16 was kind of put into fire because there was an immediate need. It is a medium lift helicopter. As you see, 2 blades for both the tail and the main rotor. This was the first turbine engine helicopter in U.S. government or U.S. military service, I should say. It was a single engine design. The initial version could carry up to 8, including the pilot. And initially, like this here, it was not armed. This was a cargo, or a transport, or a medical evac helicopter, which is pretty much what the U.S. had used helicopters for up until this point. Really, the earliest armed ones in the military were for the Navy, the anti-submarine, anti-shipping, which would soon appear. But for the Army and Air Force, they were still kind of more of the mindset of this was basically a flying deuce and a half, to land troops. It's a very good, very ahead of its time chopper. Now, the 1A would quickly give way. Pretty much in 1960, 61, 62, Bell was continuing to refine the design. This wasn't anything classified. It was, a commercial thing. So that's where the 204 designation comes from. That was the commercial name. The B would be introduced a very short time later. Had a slightly redefined, slightly enlarged cabin. A little more legroom, if you will. Then the C would be especially made. Now, the C had a pretty long development program. They started working on it around 1961, but it really didn't go into full production until 66. The C was still this type of airframe, but it had a more powerful engine, redesigned rotor blades, and it was designed to have higher performance. It had a higher top speed, more fuel on board, had a higher maximum altitude, and it could, most importantly, lift more, including weapons. Pretty much everyone in the U.S. military adopted this. The U.S. Army would start using the UH-1B. The U.S. Marines would adopt the UH-1B with some customizations, especially with comms gear and whatnot. This variant would be the UH-1E. The Air Force would also select the UH-1B initially, but they wanted it to use a common power plant with their other rotary winged aircraft like the H-3. So it was fitted with that power plant and became the UH-1F. And the U.S. Navy would take the UH-1B, modifying it, and a lot of them are actually leftover Army choppers, becoming the Seawolf. Now, helicopters like this, in the transport and cargo, were known as slicks. And really about the most they would have in the way of armament were door gunners, because each door could open and, gun. But that was not really their primary thing. Of course, they could also carry medical litters and whatnot. As far as this Hobbymaster motto, as I said, this is an early Hobbymaster, so it doesn't have quite the refinement of later ones. Now, things I like, it's got very nice rotating blades, very slick, very smooth. That's what Hobbymaster's good at. Also, this axle up here is metal. Pretty heavy and weighted, this whole thing. The main body back here is die-cast. Of course, that's hollow. See how it rotates? My only complaint, the nose is plastic, which you'd expect with all the detail, but for some reason mine's loose. Now, it's not going to fall off, it's in there, but it's just a little loose, like it just wasn't quite screwed in. I need to find a way to tighten that up. I can't figure out how, because there's not enough of a gap to put glue in there, but I've also tried just pulling it off, and that doesn't work either. I thought if I could just pull it off, put a little glue on the edge, and pop it back on. I'll check. It's no big deal. I mean, you can't even tell sitting on a shelf. But it bugs me because otherwise it's a really neat model. And these were back when Hobbymasters were quite inexpensive. $30-40. Yeah, like I said, this was made in Italy by Agusta under license. And this particular model is one made for the Austrian Air Force in Europe. So, that's the boring transport versions. What about the armed ones? So it didn't take long in Vietnam for the Huey to get some teeth. At first it was done very much on a local level, very ad hoc. Later it'd be kind of more official. This here has rockets. Sometimes these were known as frogs, but it seems like hog, or even heavy hog, is a more common, at least today, name, for obvious sense. They're very fat and kind of clunky looking. Obviously, it took a lot of the cargo transport capacity away. Others were fitted with machine guns and were known simply as guns or cobras, kind of foreshadowing the later AH-1 Cobra, also from Bell. Actually very similar to this, just a specific attack version. And these were becoming very common by 1965, 1966, and were pretty effective. They were good in the sense that they could just hang whatever they wanted off of them. And they were well liked for their ability to so-called dust off, just land, do what they need to do, and they just take off. They even tried fitting wire-guided tow missiles on these. Now, a lot of the older UH-1Bs were upgraded with the newer power plant from the 1C and so on, which gave them better weapons lift capability. However, by 1966, 1968, certainly by 1970, really an armed Huey was not great. The Vietnamese had anti-aircraft equipment that was able to really take these out, because remember, this was never designed as a attack helicopter, so it was, doing a role it was never meant to do, and it did it very well with that in mind. But by the late 60s, the Vietnamese were getting pretty savvy, and they were getting better and better surface-to-air missiles, and so these were supplemented and then replaced by the Cobras. And so towards the end of Vietnam, I'm not saying the Hueys quit being armed altogether, but for the most part, it was an interim measure, an ad hoc solution, and really showed how flexible and versatile the 204 series was. Now, like I said, this is the one model you have seen in a previous video. It's from Amercom. This is an economic company. Their models are very inexpensive. Cheapest I've seen was $15. The most is $25. They are still diecast. The body on this is metal. The, of course, extensions and all that are plastic. And I'd say for an Amercom model, this is one of their better ones. It seems to be very durable. It's been knocked over a few times and whatnot. I've had it for a while. It's held up pretty well. Comes with the stand, very similar to that Hobby Master. Sits on it real well. There's a little kind of ridge in the bottom. It plugs into two holes, but there's a little ridge that runs in between them that gives a little extra support. Of course, it too has moving rotor blades. Now, the Amercom aircraft tend to have pilot figures, but for some reason their helicopters do not. Oh well. And these are based on the old IXO tooling. As I've said in other videos about Amercom, they're actually pretty good on the detail level. Pretty good paint. The metal they use is acceptable, but it tends to be a little on the thin side. And also their quality control. Sometimes if you really like a aircraft, you might just want to buy two. And, because sometimes their quality control can be a little slipshod, and as cheap as they are, it's not really worth asking for a return and going through all that rigmarole at the model shop. Now, they don't come in broken. I'll give them that. They're packaged fine. They're just in blister packs, but they just, the glues, if I've had some where they don't quite line up properly, and, the seams aren't always as well hidden as on more expensive models. And they do have usually 2 screw holes in the bottom, but I mean, good grief, this is a $20 model. And they do a lot of models that other factories don't do. So, with that in mind, it's pretty neat. And they're great place holders, or just things to fill out your shelf with. And hey, it's a Iroquois with rockets on there. I mean, who doesn't like that? I'm sure Boba Fett would approve. Because he's got rockets. Or a rocket pack, rather. Did I mention I'm very tired? So yeah, that is the Bell 204 series. What about later versions like the 205 and 212 though? Figured to make this a twofer since basically it's the same model. And they're both from Altaya. On the left we've got a U.S. Air Force UH-1N, so-called Twin Huey, although officially still just called an Iroquois. And on the right, we've got the Agusta AB 212, so-called ASW for anti-submarine warfare or anti-shipping warfare, navalized version, made in Italy. It too is a Twin Huey. This really dates back to the early 60s. After the success with the upgraded 1B, Bell started working on an enlarged version known as the UH-1D or Model 205. It essentially had a longer cabin with room for up to 14 passengers. Now, typically, you would have a pilot, a co-pilot, a crew chief, a gunner, and then about 8 to 10 troops. But in a pinch, you could have 14 troops and a pilot. Of course, it would need a more powerful engine. Now, the 205 would still have just a single turboshaft engine. And it would be used by the U.S. military in Vietnam relatively early on. The initial version flew in 1963 and then would start appearing in Vietnam a short time later. And of course, it was a larger aircraft compared to the B, and so there are certain detractions from that. So the 205 models, primarily the 1D and 1H, were still used for personnel transport, but they were armed up. And even when the smaller 204s started to be phased out, at least in the combat roles, by the Cobra, more of the 205s were kept around. You know, kind of liking what Bell was cooking. In 1968, in May, the Canadian government authorized the purchase of 50 new models known as the Twin Huey, or in company parlance, the Model 212. This would basically be a 205, but built with two Canadian-made Pratt & Whitney turboshaft engines. While they could still only carry 15 people, they did have a greater lift capability of around 4,400 pounds internal, whereas the initial version here could carry around 3,900 pounds internal. In underslung, they could carry 5,000 and even more in some situations. So basically it was a carry thing, plus having two engines gave them a backup. The Twin Huey could fly even loaded up on one engine, at least for some time. You know, not going to be making a transatlantic flight on one engine, but you could get, 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes airtime, which is enough to get out of immediate danger. It also allowed the carriage of larger weapons, such as torpedoes. And yeah, now the first prototype, 212, flew in April of 1969. And actually, even before the Canadians received any of their 50 that they'd initially ordered, the U.S. Air Force placed an order in October of 1969. And not long after, the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines also became interested. Actually, the U.S. Air Force would be the first to get theirs in 1970, and by the end of that year they started to deploy them in Vietnam. It wasn't until 1971 that Canada, along with the Navy and eventually Marines, would get their 212s. And this is where the name UH-1N comes from. That was the American designation. In Canada, it was known as the CH-135. And while, it did well in Canada, there was a lot of political controversy in America about adopting this version. In fact, it looked like it might not have really gone into full-scale use because there was some complaints about the Canadian-made Pratt & Whitney engines, so much so that for the American production, they ultimately ended up having to go to an American-sourced engine. More of that Vietnam politicking because of Canada's position. Neither here nor there. But yeah, it went into service and was quite popular. The initial order was just under 300 from the U.S. Armed Forces. And most were delivered, kind of post-Vietnam, although some were still used in clandestine purposes in Asia in the 1970s. Of course, Canada would use theirs. The British Army Air Corps would purchase the Model 212. Israel would acquire some. Actually, Argentina would have some, and they would actually have two in active combat in 1992 during the Falklands War against Britain. So both combatants were using the Twin Huey. They would use them for search and rescue of downed pilots, as well as just general utility, supply, logistics. These would, of course, be armed. The U.S. Air Force would fit Gatling guns on them, or 40mm grenade launchers. The Marines probably threw a few guns and rockets on theirs too. But again, they were mostly used for transport. The Air Force, really after Vietnam period, used the Twin Huey to service and support missile sites. Especially remotely located ones, which a lot of them are, because, you don't want your missile sites, I'm not talking about nuclear missiles, targeted. So they would use the Twin Huey to fly personnel and supplies in. They would also use some as VIP transports, as would the Navy. And, evacuation, also search and rescue, and of course medical transports, because these could carry up to 6 litters, 6 stretchers, plus medical attendants. So each one could carry half a dozen injured persons. Just an all-around great utility helicopter. Relatively simple. It wasn't advanced. But it got the job done. Again, like I said at the beginning of the video, it's kind of a flying deuce and a half. There would be later versions with 4 rotors and so on and so forth, but this is kind of the ultimate main culmination. Of course, Italy, as this was produced by Agusta, the Navy would use it quite extensively. Also, the Italian Air Force would have about 3 dozen in its own service. And it would manufacture some for export as well. Canada would start to kind of draw down their Twin Huey fleet after the Cold War, starting in 1996, and really by 1999 they had struck the last one off the active registry. The U.S. government would purchase a number of the ex-Canadian 212s, and these are still very much in active service come the 21st century. In fact, the U.S. Marine Corps used these very extensively in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq, the Second Gulf War. They were used for general utility, supply, communications was a big role for them, but they were still used as they had been 40 years earlier in Vietnam for close air support. The U.S. Air Force would continue to fly theirs, as would the Army. But really, the Army would pretty quickly retire theirs. They seemed kind of the least enthusiastic about it. They would be out of active U.S. Army service by 2005, and then out of the Army Reserve by 2009. The Marines would continue to station these in combat zones with their last tour in 2010 in Afghanistan. They would still fly them for a bit longer. The last overseas assignment was in 2013, and then in 2014, on August 28th, they had an official retirement ceremony for the Marine Corps. So the Marine Corps and the Army are done, Canada's done, but the Air Force is not. In fact, in 2013, they had about 62 working flying 212s in service. Instead of scrapping them, they decided to give them a modernization. They've actually been thinking about it and even trying to hold programs to replace the Twin Huey for a number of years already at this point, but they decided to modernize them. It was considered a low-cost and low-risk program. They would add GPS, they would add new terrain-following radar, they would upgrade the safety systems, including the structural and the seats and everything, and this, that, and the other. And this was, I wouldn't really call it a midlife upgrade, more of a twilight upgrade, but they were hoping it could keep them flying for another 5 to 10 years. So while the U.S. Marine Corps was retiring theirs, the Air Force was retrofitting theirs. In fact, at least 24, probably more, U.S. Marine Corps Twin Hueys were transferred to the Air Force in 2014-2015. That's not to say that these were just, the primary frontline helicopter. Of course not. In the Army, they were first replaced by the Cobra in some roles, later by the UH-60 Blackhawk. The Navy was never a huge user, and of course they had other aircraft like the Sea King and the Sea Sprite and the Seahawk. Air Force really was kind of the main user. And in fact, right now, at the very tail end of 2019, they still are actively using this aircraft. Although last year, 2018, they did finally announce they had selected its replacement, the Boeing, I'm sorry, I am tired, guys. The Boeing UH-139, which is based on the Agusta. Now Agusta Westland 139 will be its new replacement, and 84 of the new helicopter are on order. However, the first ones are not expected to be in active service until 2021, meaning that the UH-1 here will still be in some service for probably the next 5, maybe even more years in the Air Force. A testament to its design. They've built over 16,000 Hueys of all variations, and they're still very much in use today. It's just such an iconic helicopter, not just for America and Vietnam, but just the world. One of the first truly globally successful helicopters. Has reasonably good performance, especially with stand time. It could do about 130 to 140 miles per hour, depending on which variant. It could get up to about 17 to 20,000 feet. The smaller frame versions were about 57 feet long, and the larger ones were about 58 8 feet. And the rotor diameter, the disc diameter would be up a little bit too. Very successful. And as our last models, the Altaya. I really like Altaya for what they are. I will say that this version over here, the U.S. Air Force, for whatever reason, it seems to be the heaviest one of all 4 of these. Which is weird because you'd think this other Altaya with more stuff hanging off of it would be heavier, but who knows. They're pretty cheap, although not. They're in the middle. They're not as cheap as Amercom, but they're not as expensive as a Hobby Master, even a cheaper Hobby Master. That's my Amercom. Like I said, they're $15 to $25. Whereas the Hobby Master, not sure what these go for today. They were about $35 to $45. I don't think there's still much. I think I saw Aiken still has them for around $50. But they've been out of production for a while. And they made other versions. This is just the one I have. The Altayas seem reasonably durable. I like that they come with a very wide stand that attaches at 2 points. And they have nicely spinning rotors. Don't expect like Corgi level quality. These are still cheaper models because these are in the $25 to $35 range, even today. I like them too because they typically come armed. One thing I don't like about the Altayas, and the same goes for Amercom, if you do have an aircraft that has moving, like retracting landing gear, whatever, the Altayas will always be in the down out position, which of course on a aircraft like this with skids absolutely doesn't matter. But if you were to get, say, a Sea King from them, it's going to have the landing gear down, which is, a thing. It's okay, but I definitely like the Hobby Master's way of doing gear up or down. Corgi is the same way. The Hobby Master probably is the most metal. Again, the only thing that really bugs me is this wiggly nose. I almost wish it would come off so I could just fix it. This bugs me. It's not a big deal, but these Altaya, they're very chunky, very solid feeling. They don't always have as much detail. And they don't come in any kind of fancy packaging. It's just a blister pack like the Amercom. But they definitely seem a little higher quality, especially in the plastic. They tend to have a little heavier metal content. Oops, sorry, that was me. Dehumidifier kicked on, I wasn't expecting it. I get jumpy when I'm tired. You get jumpy when you're tired? I do. Long day. But yeah, I just felt like revisiting one of the coolest helicopters. Why not, Why not? But really, any 4 of these 172 scale diecast, I wouldn't be ashamed to have. But I do think the Altaya is kind of that nice mix of quality and value. Anyway, guys, I did an older video on the Huey, and in that I also showed the Air Force One 148 scale Huey, which is a UH-1H. I didn't feel like bringing it out tonight, so just did these. Plus, these are all scaled together, so it's nice to kind of see that. So yeah, helicopter month continues, I guess. It's just kind of what I've been into lately. Anyway, I appreciate you staying with me. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, I will catch you very soon next time.